What's one? So basically, today's video is gonna be like kind of like a 2024 review video. So basically, I'm gonna be going over like some of the good parts I had in 2024, some of the bad things that happened this year, and how this year was compared to like past years this decade, and some of the things I did accomplish this year, and some of the goals I didn't meet. So I also did have like a lot less motivation to film and edit videos after having lots of problems with like trying to upload. This mainly kind of started like during the summertime, like in June and all that. I mean, before that, I was able to like upload videos completely fine at my house and all that, but because like the uploading process like hardly works with my house's Wi-Fi, mainly with YouTube. I mean, it just won't let me like upload YouTube videos with the house's Wi-Fi carrier, so just anywhere that uses that Wi-Fi, you can't upload videos, and it's like the only Wi-Fi my house can have too, so I've been having to like upload videos at other places since the summer, so yeah, it's basically made this year like the hardest year I've ever had with uploading videos before. Other than maybe when I like first was trying to like do it for like the very first time, like in 2017, learning how to upload a longer video. But I mean, other than that, I mean, this has definitely been the hardest year I've ever had with uploading videos. So I also did have another year where I had a much earlier end to like the summer uploads, and also significantly less like summer videos compared to like 2020 through 2022. And I think part of that was because of the ankle injury that I had in September. That does bring me to like my next major highlight this year. So basically in September, like early September, like right after Labor Day, I ended up like injuring my ankle, and that ended up like impacting like my last month of having summer uploads, and it also has like made it where I had to give up on a lot of like physical activities I used to enjoy doing, like flipping being the main one, but pretty much like throughout September I wasn't able to do like a lot of like other stuff as well, like running and jumping and all that. I have been slowly been able to do more stuff throughout like the last 3 months of the year, but that was like another major thing that happened with me this year. One good thing about this year though, like I did get to do a lot more vacationing than what I got to do last year. I really enjoyed like the early and mid part of the year, getting to like do some like traveling stuff, mostly in March and July. Those 2 months were like the two main months where I was doing a lot of traveling. Other than that, the other months were kind of like just like pretty boring though. Overall, this year was a much better traveling year for me than last year was, but I still did have a lot of bad moments throughout this year outside those experiences, and life got really boring and awful ever since like the ankle injury too. So this was a pretty hard year for like my mental health because of like how lonely of a year this was, and like just a lot of people that I was once close with like moving on to like different paths of their life and all that, and also because of the ankle injury, and just even to this day, I mean, there's still a lot of stuff I'm trying not to do yet because I want to be fully healed again before I like try to do flips and stuff like that. But like I'm able to do hiking and some climbing. I am also able to run a little bit, but I mean, other than that, I'm still somewhat limited, but at least I'm doing better than what I was like when I first injured myself. So I feel like this year was very different from like the life that I used to have, and it was even somewhat different from last year because I mean, last year had its own set of problems from like what this year had, so they were not like the same like stuff that I was having to deal with. So I feel like not every single part of the year was bad either. It's just like certain parts, like 2023 was more bad during the first half of the year, and this year was definitely more bad during the second half. So I feel like I disliked these years for their own different reasons, and there were some good time periods in between like the bad parts of the years, but I feel like overall, I mean, the last 2 years were not as good as like past years I had. So basically for this part of the video, I'm gonna be going over how I felt about some of the months I had this year. So I'm gonna be starting off with January. It felt like it was kind of like an extension of 2023 in a way. I mean, in my opinion, it was like the worst January I've had in 8 years. It was even worse than January 2023. New Year's wasn't really the best, but it was better than the last two ones I did have. So at least New Year's was an improvement from the last 2 years, but my birthday was pretty decent this year, but probably my least favorite birthday that I had this decade so far, and I didn't really like do much for my birthday this year. I did go to like a couple of parks on my actual birthday, but that was about it. This year's like Martin Luther King Jr. Day was probably the worst one I've ever had in my entire life. It was like also during that weekend where it got really cold. That was also my birthday weekend as well. I also really hated the end of the month as well, and hardly got to really do anything that month due to my work schedule and pretty much having like crappy weather throughout most of the month. it was also a really bad month with my YouTube, and I only had like one video out the entire month, and I only filmed like one video in the entire month as well, so it was like a pretty bad start to the year. I really didn't like January this year, and even last year's was better. So now, basically how I felt about like February is it was definitely an improvement from how January was, and also was much better than the past two Februarys I had as well. So it was probably the best February I've had since like the February before we ended up like going into lockdown. Overall, we had much better weather throughout that month than we did in January, and it was also the month that I found out that I got into the lottery system to do the Angel's Landing hike during spring break. It wasn't like the most exciting month that I've had, and I still wasn't like filming a lot of videos throughout February, but felt like it was like the real start of 2024, since January still kind of felt like I was like still in 2023. So February was definitely a better month than January, and it was probably the best February I've had in a while. So I actually thought February was pretty decent this year. So now basically how I feel about March is it was probably the best March I've ever had in my entire life, and it was even better than like March of 2017 was. This year's spring break was like far better than any other spring break I've had this decade so far, because this decade, before this year, I have not had the best luck with spring break. I mean, 2021 spring break was pretty decent, but like it still wasn't like the best spring break I've ever had, but it still was a lot better than 2020, 2022, or 2023, which all those years I had pretty terrible spring breaks. This is like the first good spring break I've had in at least 5 years, so I would even say this year's spring break was better than the one I had in 2017, which before this year was the best spring break I've ever had in my life. That was the year where I went to like Orlando for 5 days, but I would even say this year was better than that spring break. So this year is like officially like the best spring break I've ever had in my life. So got to see a lot of amazing places throughout that month. So I would say that March was absolutely amazing this year, and I would even say it was like the best month I ended up like having this year too. So now I'm gonna be moving on to like how I felt about April this year. So in my opinion, honestly, it wasn't a great month for me other than the day that I went out to see the solar eclipse though. I mean, that day was really exceptional and will always be a core memory that I have for like the rest of my life. But other than that though, I absolutely hated this month. I mean, it was not as bad as January was, even like if you were to take out the eclipse entirely. I mean, the month was still not as bad as January ended up like being, but it was pretty awful for April though, and I hardly did anything throughout that month compared to like what I did like in the past during April. Even like during last year's April, which wasn't like the most like fulfilling like month that I had, and where I didn't do a whole lot either. I mean, even that month I did more than I did this April, so I would have definitely like rated this month a lot worse than it was. I mean, if it wasn't for like the solar eclipse. So basically how I felt about like May this year is honestly it was not really the best month for me. I did get to go back out to Kincaid like towards the end of the month this year though, and I went out to like a few different places throughout my hometown area. Other than that though, things were really boring and depressing throughout that whole month, and I especially hated the first half of May this year. It was even worse than any moment that I had during January this year, and I think like May as a whole though was still better than January though, because I mean the rest of May was still kind of crap though, but I mean early May was the only significantly bad part, and things did start to get better throughout the second half of May. So there was one day towards like the very end of May though that I was stuck in a really bad traffic jam though, and that was not really a fun experience, but I mean I did get to go and enjoy the park later on that day, and so that's basically how I felt about like May this year. So basically June, it was pretty like bad for like it being a June, and it was nowhere near as good as like June of last year and the experience I had then. Mid-June was definitely not the best time for me though, and I had some pretty bad luck with day trips, like with that late May trip out the Gardens of the Gods being in the traffic jam, and then there's also like a couple different times I was in traffic jams on some day trips throughout mid-June. So not only that, but like during mid-June I also had like a really bad experience after one of my Kincaid Lake visits. That was basically the trip that I got pulled over on my way home because of my tag lights being out, and which I didn't know about before I had done that trip either, and I almost got a ticket for it. So mid-June was a pretty bad time period for me, but things did get a bit better for me in late June though, and I was able to have a successful bungee jump trip. There was like barely any traffic on that trip, and things went pretty well within that bungee jumping trip. So I also did go out to like a couple of different places in like Indiana, like Cataract Falls in late June, and ended up being a pretty good trip as well. So late June was definitely improvement from mid June, and early June was pretty decent this year. I did like Johnson Shuns and stuff like that. So mid June was like the only like really bad part of June, but definitely not as good as like past Junes I had. It was still a lot better than April and May was this year, and definitely was better than June of 2021. If you guys remember that from the 2021 recap video. So basically how I felt about like July is it was definitely a better month for me than like the last 3 months were, and it was the best month I had since March and doing that spring break trip. So it was definitely my favorite month of the summer. I still had a decent amount of bad moments throughout the month though, even though it was definitely a lot better than our months I had this year. At the very beginning of the month, I got to do like a follow-up trip back out to Chattanooga. After I did do the Chattanooga trip, there was a stretch of July that did kind of suck though for a bit. Yeah, 4th of July was not great. It was still better than the 4th of July I had in 2021. I don't think there's going to be a single 4th of July I have in my life that will be as bad as the 2021 4th of July, even if I like do absolutely like nothing for 4th of July. Things did start to like get better for me though during the second half of the month where I got to like do an overnight at Giant City during one of the weekends, and I got to see some of my favorite parks in Southern Illinois during that 2 day stretch. And then right after I did that, I ended up like doing like a short Colorado getaway. It was like a free night 4 day trip, so it was one of the worst months I had though, like when it came to like the people that I had encountered throughout that month and deal with. But I mean, it was still a pretty decent month. August started off really horribly. Like I ended up like getting pretty sick, ended up getting like a sore throat and all that during that weekend, and it was not a great weekend for me at all. I still did have some good moments throughout the month of August though, like going back to like the one park with the castle structure, getting to visit a new place in Southern Illinois for the first time, doing a follow-up Indiana trip, and also at the very end of the month I got to see like another cave and got to see like this cool town. So I mean I did get to do some stuff throughout the month of August, but I mean it was definitely more boring than like June and July were, and I would say it was like definitely not as good as like some Augusts I had in the past, like August of 2022 and even last August. So it was like the least amount of stuff that I'd done throughout August since I was like still in high school and had to like start school in early August. So this September was by far the worst September I had this entire decade so far, and honestly the worst September I've had probably in my life, to be honest. And the first 3 days after like I ended up hurting my ankle were an absolute living hell to get through. And this was by far a worse injury than the knee injury that I had in July, because that only lasted like over the weekend. It was pretty sore over that weekend. It was kind of hard to do flips and stuff like that, but I mean, once I like got to like Monday and Tuesday that next week, I was able to pretty much do like everything I used to do before. So definitely my least favorite month of 2024, even worse than January was, and I thought January was a pretty terrible month this year. Things did start getting kind of better towards the end of the month. I was able to do like one day trip at the end of the month, like at the last minute, but I mean, it wasn't like my best day trip either because I mean, I was very limited on like what I could do. I wasn't able to do like a lot of crazy stuff on the trip, and wasn't the most fun day trip I went on because I was still trying to recover from my ankle whenever I did it. But I mean, yeah, I did not like this month at all. So basically how I felt about like October is overall it was a pretty big improvement from like what September was. My ankle made a lot of progress throughout the month. I was able to do some more like long distance hiking at the end of the month, like whenever I went back out to Starved Rock again. I did go to like a haunted house like off camera at the beginning of the month, but other than that I didn't do a whole lot during the beginning of the month. But throughout the later half of the month though, I did quite a bit of stuff. Like I did go to Fright Fest like multiple different times off camera, and I also did do some hikes around home as well throughout the month. So I did do quite a bit of stuff during the second half of the month, and it wasn't quite as good as like some of the past Octobers I had, but it still was one of the most like decent months of 2024. I ended up having a pretty good Halloween this year, a lot better than the last 3 years. So now basically how I felt about November this year. This month started off like being pretty decent. I ended up like going to Fright Fest one last time at the beginning of the month. I also did that like right after visiting Han that same day and doing the hike there and filming that video. So I also did go back out to Grafton, and I also did go hiking at Little Grand Canyon and saw some fall colors there before like the fall colors like were all dead and all that. So I did have a pretty good first week of the month. I mean, after that, this month got pretty boring for quite a while. Like it was a much better month for my ankle though. So that was one good thing. It was even better than like how it was in October. So But once like we got kind of like closer to the holiday season and like Thanksgiving and all that, I did do a couple of Christmas stuff at the end of the month, so at least I didn't have to like spend Thanksgiving this year like being at a job or anything like that. So I definitely had a lot better Thanksgiving this year than last year. In my opinion, I honestly like this November a lot more than like past Novembers I had, because usually like November's like among like my worst months of the year. There's been some years where it's been the worst month of the year, like 2014, 2018, all that. Even like whenever it wasn't like the worst month of the year, there have been other years where I've had like a really bad experience with this month. So I mean, considering that I had like worse months this year and like it also wasn't among like my worst months either, I would say that like this November wasn't that bad. And then basically how I felt about December. To be completely honest, it was a pretty shitty month for me this year, especially like mid-December, like mostly mid-December. But I mean, I will say that the first week of the month was pretty good though, and I did like a lot of Christmas stuff during that first week, and that was like when I did the majority of like filming for that Christmas video that I had this year. So I mean, the first week of this month was pretty good. I did a lot of fun stuff then, and I thought this month was gonna be a pretty good month after having a pretty good first week. But then like once mid-December hit, like everything just started getting really shitty this month, and I would even say that like mid-December this year was even shittier than January was. Things did start to get kind of better though, like once like late December hit, like around like the real Christmas time and all that. So I will say that Christmas Eve and Christmas Day were pretty good for me this year. To be honest, I'm pretty disappointed in how this December turned out, because this was actually like my first December that I had since I left my warehouse job, and I was really hoping it was gonna be a lot better than the last two Decembers because of that. But I feel like the month overall wasn't as bad as like January or September was, but it was definitely among like my worst months of 2024. So basically the worst seasons I had this year, I would have to say the late summer into early fall was a really terrible time. Like basically September, like when I first injured my ankle, and then I also wasn't a big fan like the later half of spring, like especially after the solar eclipse, like the time period between like the end of the eclipse and like the beginning of summer. I felt like those were like my worst seasons of the year. My favorite seasons I would say were like the early spring, like whenever I was doing the spring break trip, and then early midsummer. So basically the spring break trip was like one of the major highlights I had this year. Getting to see more Vegas, getting to like zip line at the Grand Canyon West, getting to hike Bryce Canyon in the snow, doing the two like most awesome trails in Zion. Got to do like Angel's Landing for the first time and doing the Narrows. Like I remember like when I first went to Zion, I did a little bit of the Narrows, but I only like really crossed one section and went back. This time I got to have like more of experience doing the Narrows, so getting to see Antelope Canyon and like Sedona, and then doing the last minute trip to Death Valley whenever I like missed my flight that one day, and along with the spring break trip being probably the most major highlight of the year, I did have some other highlights this year. So the first major highlight that I had outside of the spring break trip was the solar eclipse in April. Ended up like being like one of the coolest experiences I've ever had in my life, getting to like see that, and I also didn't have to like travel too far to get to see it, and I think it was definitely worth going out to like Giant City to go and see the eclipse rather than trying to see it in my hometown, because I wouldn't have gone like full totality at home. So, and I did get to do some stuff in Giant City like outside the eclipse too, so it was really nice getting to go out there that day, and really fun experience. So I also think this year's solar eclipse was a lot better than the one I saw in 2017. So the next one that I probably had was like getting to do a second bungee jumping trip in like late June, and getting to like see a new place in Kentucky afterwards. So the next major highlight that I had this year was like the early July Tennessee getaway, and like getting to see the Rock City Gardens for the first time. And I still did have some nice waterfall experiences, even though they weren't like as strong as past years. So also the Giant City overnight trip was another major highlight. I also did really enjoy getting to go to Colorado not too long after, and like getting to see some stuff for the first time, like the Mount Blue Sky, which used to be Mount Evans before last year. And then I did get to go back to Colorado's Garden of the Gods again, and then I got to see the Great Sand Dunes for the first time. And then after I got to see that, I ended up like seeing a waterfall at the last minute, which ended up being a lot better than I expected. And then after that, I got to see like a really nice sunset at the place. So I also did get to go to like a nice hot springs on the very first day of the trip too, so ended up like being a really nice getaway. Another major highlight that I had this year was like getting to do Star Rock again, and probably like ended up being the most like nice fall colors I saw on like any of the fall trips I went there. So I also did get to do multiple Grafton trips this year, like one time in the summer and then a couple different times during the fall, where I got to like do the mountain coaster there for the first time in the summer, and then I also did get to try out their zip lining in the fall and all that. So those ended up like being some really fun trips going out there, and also not that far of a drive from my house and all that. So, and then basically the last major highlight that I had this year was like getting to do multiple different Christmas activities again, and getting to go back out to like the one rocking chair area during the Christmas time. So that was basically like the last major highlight that I had this year. So now I'm gonna be moving on to like how I felt about like this year as a whole. So I would say that 2024 was a disappointment in a way, because I mean, once January ended and all that, things were like going really great for me, especially with like the spring break getaway and like doing those amazing hikes on the trip and all that. I was thinking like the rest of the year was gonna be like that, and it's gonna be like a major comeback from last year and all that. But once we kind of like got back from the trip, and like especially once the solar eclipse was over, it was a pretty depressing time period for me until June or sometime like that. So I feel like outside of like the major highlights I was doing throughout the summer, I feel like there's just a lot of like periods of like stress, and like I felt like it was just a pretty depressing summer for me, and I feel like everything got worse like once I got back from Colorado, especially once August ended and I ended up like injuring my ankle and all that. I just feel like on average this year was getting worse and worse for me. So, and I think September was definitely the low point this year. I feel like things are starting to kind of get better from like what they were in September, but I still feel like they were worse though than like what they were in the summer and especially before that. So at least it is better than what September was, but I feel like this time last year was better for me than right now. So even though this was a pretty hard year for me, I mean, I still did have a lot of like really good moments throughout this year, and it wasn't all bad, but I'm still pretty disappointed in like how it turned out, especially with the ankle injury happening, and that's why I'm not expecting a lot from 2025, because I just don't want to have like it just like blow up in my face, kind of like what happened this year. So basically for the last part of this video, I'm gonna be going over some of the goals I met, some of the goals I somewhat met, and then like the goals I didn't meet. So the first goal that I feel like I met this year was like trying some more like different places during the summertime, and also like not just the summer but like throughout the year as well. And I feel like throughout the year I did like some like smaller stuff like for the first time, whether it's like a place that's like a little bit further away from home, or like some places closer to home that I never went to for the first time. So the next major goal that I feel like I met this year was like traveling more than I did last year at least. I mean, I ended up like going on the spring break trip in March, and then doing a Colorado getaway in July, and then also some other smaller getaways throughout July. Like I feel like I did travel a lot more than I did last year, maybe other than like the later part of the year. And then basically the last major goal that I felt like I met was having a much better work situation than what I experienced last year. So I ended up like leaving my warehouse job like sometime in February, something like that. Pretty much everything that I like struggled with this year and hated about this year was like stuff that wasn't related to work in any way. So maybe other than January when I was like still at the warehouse job, I mean, I felt like I did meet that goal of like getting myself a better work situation than what I did last year. Some of the goals I feel like I somewhat met, like didn't fully meet though. The first one was like doing the one swing at the Royal Gorge Bridge that someone suggested me like last year whenever I went bungee jumping. So I didn't end up doing the swing while I was there. There was one part of the goal that I did kind of meet. It was like at least getting to see Royal Gorge Bridge for the first time, and I don't feel like I really met that goal that much, but I mean, at least I did get to see the bridge, so that was something at least. So I would probably lean that more towards like not meeting the goal because I didn't do the swing and all that. So, and then basically the other goal that I feel like I somewhat met was like going harder with the summer adventures. I did really good with that throughout July, like with all the trips and all that, and like late June with the bungee jumping and all that. But I mean, I feel like throughout the rest of the summer, especially the very end of the summer, I feel like I didn't really do a whole lot of crazy summer adventures and all that. And then basically lastly, this is like some of the goals I didn't meet this year. So the first major goal that I feel like I didn't meet this year was like making this year a better year than 2023, and like also the other years in this decade. So I feel like I did do good with that in like some aspects, like by having a much better work situation than last year. But when it's come to like other things going on in my life, especially with like ever since I injured my ankle in the last part of the year. I feel like I have not made this year a better year than like 2023, let alone like the other ones in this decade. So I feel like overall 2023 might have actually been slightly better than this year. Not by much, but slightly better than this year, especially with everything that's happened the last 4 months. So another goal that I didn't meet this year was getting back into college again, like figuring like something with a degree and all that. I was planning on like going back to school like during this fall semester after I had like stopped working at my warehouse job this past winter. But after like everything that like happened after getting home from like my spring break trip, I feel like I've lost the motivation to go back. And especially even more so after injuring my ankle and all that. Even if I had like started school this like past fall semester, like I feel like I just would have done bad, like a lot worse than what I did in 2021 and 2022. Another goal that I feel like I didn't meet this year was don't give up on anything even when it gets like stressful or difficult. I feel like with this year I've like given up quite a bit on like things compared to like in the past, especially ever since the ankle injury and all that. So, and then the last major goal that I feel like I didn't meet this year was like being able to do backflips again and maybe being able to do it on ground. But even like with getting myself to at least do it on trampoline again, I still didn't meet that goal because I wasn't able to get myself to do it at any point this year. I don't see myself being able to do it anytime soon. So not only did I not meet the goal of being able to do backflips again this year, but even the flips that I was able to do in 2023 and like the earlier part of this year, I haven't been able to do any of those again since my ankle injury. So I feel like I actually got worse. So I definitely did not meet that goal this year. So those were basically the goals I met, didn't meet, and like somewhat met this year. Hoping you guys enjoyed like this 2024 review video. And honestly, it wasn't like my best year, but there were like some good moments throughout this year, and I don't think it was like all bad, even though I feel like it was slightly worse than last year even. I'm just hoping at least things will get like somewhat better with like my ankle and all that, and I hope I don't have like another like major injury next year. So I'm not having any high expectations for next year. So I hope you guys did have a good year though this year, and I hope you guys had like a really good holiday season, enjoy Christmas and all that, and hope you guys end up having like a good New Year's this year as well. So if this year was not really a good year for you, I hope that 2025 will be a much better year than this year was. So stay tuned for more videos I have throughout 2025. I mean, I don't know like how much I'm gonna be doing throughout the winter season, like January and February, but it just like depends on like how much snow we get, if I'm able to like film like some winter themed videos. And I also don't know how much I'm going to be filming in 2025 too. I mean, it might end up being a little bit less than past years, so just kind of see what happens. But I really do hope you enjoyed like your 2024, and hopefully 2025 ends up being a better year for everybody. So without further ado, I'll see you guys next year.